today we're going to go over our installation of the Jesel Rocker System for a 6-liter Ford Powerstroke. It'll be really similar to other applications as far as adjusting the valves. We'll do separate videos for the 6.4 stuff and the 6.7 as well. So these are our pedestals. They're going to install into the rocker boxes. And this is a 04.5 and later style rocker box here that takes the wavy style rails. On the it affects just a small percentage of trucks out there, but on some of the 03s, the pedestal will line up correctly on the 03s. On some, but not all, of the 03 style rocker boxes for the log style oil rails, some of them have an extra casting right here. This one doesn't, but some of them have an extra casting right here. That just needs to be clearanced in order for the rocker shaft to go on here. Most customers are running the wavy oil rails anyway, but anyway, for anyone running an 03 or the 03 style rails, some of these heads have a casting right here that the rocker pedestal or rocker stand will interfere with. And again, that affects a really small number of 03 trucks, but right here would need to be clearanced. On the regular 05 and later stuff, it does not need to be clearanced. So anyway, our Dave's over there modifying the head gasket, and so you can see here the head gasket has been clearanced in here where the push rods go. The Jesel system is self-aligning, so it doesn't need the holes and the guides in the head gasket for the push rods. So you want to just clip those out. Dave has some just using some tin snips and has cut the the portion of the gasket there out. Now everything will drop on, and push rods won't interfere. Okay, so we have all of our head fasteners and rocker kit components all laid out here. And so we've got our LSM valve lash adjusting tool, a 3/8 torque wrench, and a tool to turn the motor over. And so now Dave is installing the push rods, being sure to get the push rod into the seat of the lifter. You can see there that the push rod is seated all the way in the seat on the lifter down there. That's really important, because if you stick the push rod down there and it's not in the seat, the rest of this doesn't really matter, and your valve adjustment will be incorrect. Right, next, Dave is lubing up the other end of the push rod, and then we're going to lube up the tips of the valves, and then we're going to install the bridges. With the Jesel kit, it does come with a tool steel bridge, and the geometry is different than the factory bridges. So you want to make sure you use the included Jesel bridge, because that's pretty critical for getting the rocker, especially on a 6-liter, to get the rocker to fit under the oil rail. And so we use this stuff on every engine. It's the CMD high pressure lube. Lucas makes other high pressure lubes. Hot Shots makes a really nice assembly lube. It all works good. Then we're going to take our bridges. Do we have a factory bridge to compare that to? I have one in here. There we go. So just to see the difference there between the bridges, you can see that the Jesel bridge is significantly higher. And what that is for is to get the tail of the rocker lower, so all of this clears underneath of the oil rail correctly. And the Jesel bridges do fit a lot tighter than the factory bridges do. The factory bridges have a lot of wiggle room. The Jesel bridges fit much more snugly on the tip of the valve, so make sure they're engaged all the way. So now that we've got all of our bridges on, push rods greased, we're going to install the rocker pedestal. So we've got our dowel pins here in each corner that locates our pedestal, and the pedestal slides on over top of the head studs. And so when the head studs are torqued down, it holds the rocker pedestal down rock solid. So from here, the head studs installed just like normal. Then we'll come back and install the rockers after the heads are fully torqued. So we snug these down. We run them down with a 3/8 impact, and we just lightly snug them up. We're not torquing. We're not hammering the impact. We snug them down in the thin that ARP recommends, and it just kind of preloads the studs and kind of takes up some of the gasket, the rocker box and the head gasket, That's after Dave got all of the inner head bolts started. You always want to get these started first, because if you tighten the head studs before you tighten the inner row head bolts, you might have a hard time getting them in. So we'll run them down with a 3/8 impact and just lightly snug everything up, which is only 15-20 foot-pounds. And then we'll follow ARP's torquing sequence. And so we'll typically put our paperwork there, work in the sequence basically in a inside out X pattern, and we'll go 90, 180, and 265. And then we'll do a separate video later on proper head stud installation and proper torque wrench techniques and all that kind of stuff. But it's actually also something we get a lot of questions about. Okay, so we've got our head studs all torqued now to spec, and so we're going to look at cylinder 1 here, which on a 6-liter is the front cylinder on the passenger side. And so now what we need to do is find top dead center on the compression stroke, and to do that we're going to rotate the engine clockwise in the normal direction of operation. We're going to watch our push rods here. So this is your intake push rod that goes to your intake valves, and that's your exhaust push rod. And you can watch, exhaust push rod is on the way down, so the exhaust would be closing. Intake is opening, all right? And now we're gonna watch, and the intake is going down, down, down. Now we're gonna take our little rod here, and we're going to stick that on top of the piston. And for what we're doing, this is gonna get us really close to TDC. And so we're gonna basically turn the engine over until we get to top dead center, and until it stops moving. There's a few other ways to do this. If you're doing this with the engine before it's assembled, you can look at your gears back here and make sure your gears are lined up correctly. Or if you're doing this with a degree wheel, if you degreed your camshaft and all, you can use a pointer. If you have an ATI or a fluid dampener, you can mark the dampener. Fun fact on an ATI, they've actually just recently learned the TDC mark here actually lines up with this bank of the engine here when you're at TDC. The main thing is you want to make sure you're on top dead center of the compression stroke, because you don't want to be trying to install the rockers when you're on the lobe, when you're on the lift of the cam. You want to be installing the push rods, you want to be installing the rockers when you're on the heel of the cam, on the base circle of the cam. All right, so we're also going to go over how to find your push rod length here. So here we've got an adjustable push rod. You can't run the engine with this. This is just for checking purposes to find the right push rod. I think TrickFlow makes this one. You can find them on Summit Racing. We have them available. And so on this application, we know that we should be somewhere in the 10-100, 10-150 range. So we're going to start by taking our 12-inch calipers, and we'll find a 10-100 length. We're going to adjust our adjustable push rod here down to at least a good starting point. If you didn't know, what range you should be starting in, you can always start at the bottom. We're just cheating by 2-3 threads here to get us in the ballpark. So now we're going to take our adjustable push rod here, and we're going to install it into the engine. Again, we've already got it on top dead center on cylinder number 1. Just got to make sure that I get it in the push rod seat in the lifter correctly. There we go. All right, now we're going to take our rocker here and our bolts, and what we want to do is make sure that, what we want to do is make sure that our adjuster is going to be in the correct position when it's all said and done. So you can see we have a ton of lash here right now. What Jesel recommends is that you want to be no more than 2 turns out. So right now we are all the way lefty-loosey. The adjuster is sucked all the way into the rocker body. So now we're going to go all the way lefty-loosey. We're going to count our turns and go 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns, 4 turns. So that's way too much. So what we're going to do is we're going to go all the way back to 0, and we're going to go to 0, and we're going to go 1, 2 turns out, and now we're going to see if we can get in there. Sometimes you can't really get in there very good with the rocker box. Different engines are different ways. So we know we need to come out a couple turns here, so we're going to bring our adjuster out about a turn and a half, and let's stick our adjustable push rod back in there. All right, I'm going to stick our rocker back on there, and let's see, that might be too far because now we have no lash. Oh, but our adjuster is still out some. That might be pretty close. So now that we think we might be in the ballpark, I'm going to run our bolts down here. All right. Then we're going to start from all the way lefty-loosey again. We're going to count our turns and go 1, 2, right at 2. So now we know that whatever length push rod that is going to be the correct length. So we'll take that push rod out, we'll measure it, and then we would order a set of push rods. Now, Kill Devil Diesel stocks a ton of different length push rods because we found different people with different valve tip heights, you know, depending on how much was milled off of your cylinder head, how much was milled off of the engine block, etc. It can all be can all create a variance in where and what your structure is. So now that we have this adjusted, so we know when the push rod is installed, it's going to have the correct amount of adjustment on the rocker tip. What we're going to do is measure this guy, and we're going to be 10-160. So we actually happen to have a set of 10-150s here. So these will work great. Now, after we found top dead center on the number 1 cylinder on the compression stroke, now it's time to install the rockers. So before we install the rockers, we want to make sure that your adjuster here is backed all the way lefty-loosey, meaning that the adjuster cup is sucked all the way into the rocker body here. And so you want to do that to make sure that you don't go to install the rockers and be holding the valves open while you're trying to install the rockers. And so you'll see there's a good bit of lash here, you know, before you go to install them. Make sure that the flats of the rocker shaft are facing up, because that's where the bolt, torques down to. And then make sure that the push rod is seated correctly in the adjuster cup. Now we're going to install our hardware, which has ARP lube on it. And these will all torque to 24 to 26 foot-pounds. All right, so now that we have our correct length push rods in there, we're going to install the rockers. Now, it's important when you're installing them to make sure that you have lash and make sure that you have some adjustment here, because you don't want to be installing the rockers and opening the valves or, you know, with any spring pressure at all on the rocker shaft there, because if you tighten these bolts unevenly and there's pressure on it, if it's side loaded, you can actually break that rocker shaft. So that's why we use the speed handle race car parts. We treat them like race car parts. We don't run them down with an impact, because you will. These are a hardened shaft, so they'll last forever, but they're brittle. And so if you run them down with an impact, you'll crack that rocker shaft, especially if you're trying to install it on the lift on the nose of the cam. So this is why we intentionally rotate it to top dead center on the compression stroke, because that ensures that we're on the heel of the cam, and we are not going to be trying to open the valves while we install the rocker shafts. So we'll take our LSM tool, we'll make sure that we're all the way lefty-loosey, and now we're going to count our turns. So there's 1, 2, all right, so just over 2 turns, that's fine. So we go back a quarter turn and then snug up our adjuster. And so we're just rough lashing it in place right now, so we don't need to worry about torquing it. And you can see there that the tip of the adjuster is even with the nut. That's what we want to see. We don't want to see the adjuster nut sunk way down, or the adjuster sunk way down into the nut there. So we're going to rinse and repeat on the other rocker. All right, so now that our rockers on cylinder number 1 are installed, the rocker shaft bolts are tight, and we've gone to 0 lash and then backed it off a quarter turn and snugged up our adjusters. Again, this was done at top dead center on the base circle of the cam. Now we're ready to move on and install the rockers on the next cylinder. So to do that, we'll rotate the crankshaft 90 degrees in the normal direction of rotation, which is clockwise. And then we'll take the next cylinder's rockers, which we have ready here. We have our adjusters backed all the way out here, lefty-loosey, And what we're going to do is install the rockers just like we did before. So we've already checked push rod length. We should be good to go there. And I flip it over. There you go. Yep. And so we'll get our hardware started. And what we're going to do is go to install and torque the rockers. Of course, we'll make sure our push rod is lined up and make sure the rockers are installed in the right orientation. Again, we're doing this on purpose with a speed handle here, not an impact. If you're doing this in the truck and can't get a speed handle in there, you can do it with a regular wrench or a regular ratchet there. So what Dave's doing is making sure that our push rod is lined up correctly. And it's important to make sure that if you see anything binding up or something doesn't feel right, stop and investigate. Because if you run those things down, this is why we do this by hand. If you run those down with an impact and your push rod is not lined up correctly, what it can do is on the bottom side here, your push rod can actually crack. So we need this thing to focus here. Your push rod can actually crack this adjuster cup, and it could fail while in use. So what we want to do is make sure that the push rod is aligned correctly, and then make sure as you're tightening these, so we should have lash. So we should have plenty of lash. That way we're not installing the rocker shaft. If we were installing this and for whatever reason we got mixed up on our timing here or whatever, and you're trying to install the rockers when you're on the nose, the peak of the cam, you can potentially break the rocker shaft. If you're installing that and you don't have any lash and you're tightening down one side tighter than the other, it'll side load that rocker shaft and can crack it. So now that we'll go ahead and basically rough lash our rockers. So we're counting our turns, just making sure it should be the same as the other cylinders as long as your valve tip height and everything is pretty consistent. So we go all the way down to 0 lash, and then we just snug up all the way down to 0 lash, and then back a quarter turn, and then snug up the adjuster. We're going to do that for the other rocker. This takes a little bit longer than hammering the factory rockers down with an impact, but they're race car parts, and we treat them like race car parts. And these are the finest quality rockers in the world. At one point or another, Jesel has produced rocker arms for every Cup car team, every NASCAR team, the top fuel guys, everywhere. And so for the adjustability and for the precision that you get, also the ability to install and remove the rockers without having to take the head stud fasteners out, there's a lot of benefit to these. That cylinder is torqued, rough lashed. Now we're going to rotate the crankshaft 90 degrees in the normal operation of rotation again, and then we're going to install the rockers on the next cylinder in the firing order. We rotate the crankshaft every 90 degrees and install them one cylinder at a time, again to make sure that we're not opening the valves as we install the rockers. And you'll pretty much rinse and repeat this until you get all 8 cylinders on. So you rotate it 90 degrees, install the next cylinder in the firing order, rotate it 90 degrees, install the next cylinder in the firing order, and so on until you have all 8 done. It's not a bad idea to come back and make sure you torque all the bolts, and then we'll come back and set valve lash after we get all 8 cylinders on. All right, so now that we have our rockers on, we're going to pretend that we have all 8 cylinders done. When you get ready to adjust your valve lash, we use a method called ICEO, intake, closing, exhaust, opening. And what that means is with the intake closing, we're going to adjust the exhaust, and with the exhaust opening, we're going to adjust the intake. So we're going to rotate the engine in the normal direction of operation, which is clockwise. So you can see our exhaust is opening. So since we start with ICEO, we'll go ahead and start with intake. So here's intake is opening, and now intake is closing. Now that means that's when we want to adjust the exhaust. So there's lots of different kinds of feeler gauge holders here. Snap-on makes these. LSM makes some really nice stuff. So pick whatever works for you. On the 6 liter, these actually work pretty good with the curved tip on them to get under the rocker arm here. So you can see the feeler gauge slides in and out pretty easy. So we need to tighten this rocker up just a little bit. So we're going to loosen our nut, and then we're going to run down to 0 lash, and you don't need to get carried away. Just go to 0 lash. You want to be consistent is the main thing. Some people would call that 0 lash. Some people would really tighten it until they start to open the valve. You don't really want to do that. You want to go down to pretty much 0 lash, good and snug, and then make sure, of course, while you're doing that, that your feeler gauge doesn't fall out. And so 0 lash, make sure that you can move your adjuster. I snug that up a little bit. So you want it to be firm, but not so firm that you're leaving track marks on your feeler gauge there. So we will loosen up just a little bit. All right, so we will run that down, and then this is why we like these LSM tools, because it has a torque wrench built into it. There's no need to tighten the adjuster with your 3/4 inch breaker bar. They don't move around. The Jesel system is really, really solid. If it does, if you do find that your lash is different, this is another good benefit to the solid lifter stuff. If you tool up a valve, or if you have a lifter that's starting to fail or something, or a camshaft is starting to fail, you'll notice that when you do your regular maintenance on race car stuff. That's for a competition setting. For a street car setting, you know, we have customers that drive these on the street every day, and you know, we might recommend adjusting them once a year just to be safe, but typically they don't really require adjustment. So now we're going to, we just adjusted the exhaust, so the intake was closing but not quite closed. Now we're going to keep going until the exhaust is opening. So ICEO, exhaust opening. So exhaust is opening but not all the way open. Now we're going to adjust the intake. So we're going to, this one actually feels pretty close. Oops. So, but we will, so I'll always back them off about a 1/4 turn or so, and then just snug it up and click the LSM wrench there, and then so snug but not so hard that you got to take 2 hands and pull the thing out. So now we should be good to go. This cylinder is now ready to rock and roll. Now you would move on to the next cylinder and rotate until you know, ICEO, intake closing, adjust the exhaust, and then keep rotating, and then exhaust opening, you adjust the intake. You rinse and repeat that for all 8 cylinders, and you are ready to go. So the reason that we use the ICEO method is because it gives you the best chance, especially with larger performance camshafts, it gives you the best likelihood of being on the heel of the cam, meaning not the pointy part, not the nose of the camshaft. And so we do that to make sure that you're setting lash correctly. You'll see some factory service manuals that will say, you know, rotate the crankshaft 270 degrees and adjust these 3 cylinders. Rotate the crankshaft, you know, 180 degrees and adjust these 4 cylinders, etc. And that'll get you in trouble with this stuff. You'll end up trying to adjust the valves on the ramp of the camshaft instead of on the base circle of the camshaft. And so that's the reason that we do the ICEO, and that works for any, you know, 4-cycle internal combustion engine. Again, when you're all said and done, make sure that your adjusters are, you know, are not below the nut. Don't want to be more than 2.5 turns out. And make sure all your push rods and everything are lined up. You'll rotate the engine over quite a few times during this process, and that's good. That's a feature, not a bug. By rotating the engine over, if by chance you had a push rod that was misaligned with the lifter, or you had a rocker that wasn't seated correctly, etc., you'll see it during that process. And so you'll end up rotating the engine over 20 or 30 times during that process, and again, that's intentional. Then the last thing we'll do before we fire the thing up is we'll oil the rollers. We'll just pour some oil on it. These get a ton of oil while it's running up through the push rod on a 6-liter, and it runs down, it oils the rocker shaft and oils the rollers, so there's no need for extra oiling on these. But it's for first fire up, we will put some assembly lube on them. So give us a call if you have any questions or anything, 252-725-1222. Or you can email us sales@killdevildiesel.com. We'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks.